Here's my family.
Where's the popcorn?
I decided to do my speech on Phil Ochs. He's a American protest singer from the 1960s. He liked to refer to himself as a topical speaker, which is somebody who comments on political or social events. He's a songwriter that is known for his very sharp wit, humor. He was a big humanitarian. He was a political activist in many ways. And he was known also for his insightful and distinctive voice, his insightful lyrics and distinctive voice. He wrote hundreds of songs during the 1960s and released 8 albums, actually, during his lifetime. Phil Ochs performed at many different political events, anti-Vietnam War rallies, civil rights rallies. He was heavily involved with pro-democratic rallies, organized labor events, and he described himself as a left socialist Democrat who became an early revolutionary after the protests of the 1968 Democratic National Convention, which led to a riot, which in turn actively did a lot in terms of affecting his mental state, his state of mind, which I'll talk more about later. And after years of writing in the 1960s, right around 1970, his state started to decline, and he eventually was diagnosed as being bipolar, and he was an alcoholic, and he ended up taking his own life in 1976, sadly. Some of his major influences were Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, Bob Gibson, Merle Haggard. He was really into acting and movies, so he was a big John Wayne fan. And like many in the 60s, he really, really loved John F. Kennedy. He didn't always agree with a lot of his thoughts on and how he responded to like the Cuban Missile Crisis and things, but he said that his wife, in his biography, he told his wife that he thought he was going to die that night, that JFK was assassinated, and his wife said that was the only time he ever saw him cry. But he was born in Texas to John Ochs and Gertrude Finn. They moved to the United States from Ireland. His dad was drafted into the Army during World War II and ended up being an Army doctor during the Battle of the Bulge. And that affected him greatly. And he ended up receiving an honorable medical discharge. And he was also bipolar and suffered from depression. And so after his discharge from the Army, he tried to set up a medical practice but was unsuccessful. And so his family ended up moving all around the United States many different times from job to job until finally they settled in Columbus, Ohio. He had one older sister named Sonia and a younger brother named Michael. They were middle-class Jewish family, but they weren't religious. And his father died in 1963 from a cerebral hemorrhage. As a young teenager, he was recognized as a very talented clarinet player. In one evaluation, his musical instructor said, "You have exceptional musical feeling, and the ability to transfer it onto your instrument is abundant." So even at a very young age, he was very musically inclined. And really what he did was he ended up playing clarinet with the orchestra at Kaplan University. And though he studied mostly classical music and paid attention to classical music, he became interested in other sounds during that time, such as Buddy Holly, Elvis, and then country music artists like Johnny Cash and Hank Williams Sr. Like I mentioned before, he spent a lot of time at the movies, so he was a big movie buff. He later developed and which is kind of telling about his personality, an interest in movie rebels like Marlon Brando and James Dean. And just from what I've read about, what I've learned about him, that seems to be kind of where his life was going, to the rebellious point. Basically, he ended up going to Ohio State to study journalism, and he developed an interest in politics. He had radical themes, and he ended up not being named the editor-in-chief of the college newspaper, and so he started his own underground newspaper and was able to voice his radical opinions that way. Unfortunately, that also had a negative influence on his mental state, and so he dropped out the last semester before he graduated from Ohio State. He moved to New York City and performed in numerous nightclubs, and he wrote a lot of his songs about war, civil rights, labor struggles, and other topics. Let's see. And really took to folk music. Him and Bob Dylan were actually friends. They were friends, but they were rivals at the same time. Let's see, there's a quote I wanted to read here. In the early 1960s, there was a folk music rebirth in the country with the likes of Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, and Bob Dylan. Although his fame was probably limited, Ochs became an integral part of that crowd. His songs, Draft Dodger Rag and I Ain't Marchin' Anymore, became a rallying cry for the peace movement, much the same way that Dylan's did. And so his effect on music was the same as a lot of people's effect, people, during that time period. Bob Dylan, John Lennon. He actually ended up doing the first concert that John Lennon and Yoko Ono came back to the United States after the Beatles broke up. John Lennon invited him to that concert, and so he performed there. Let's see, what else is interesting here? He performed solo concerts at Carnegie Hall, and just had a lot of great music. His voice sounded a lot like what's that artist's name? Can't think of it. Edmund Fitzgerald. Gordon Lightfoot. I think his voice sounds a lot like Gordon Lightfoot. It has that unique quality to it, and I've really enjoyed learning about him. What I find, my opinion of him, is, I find his story to be pretty sad in a way, because as talented as he was not given credit for it. He wasn't appreciated enough. His music wasn't really given the respect that I believe it deserved. And I think he knew that, and he suffered from writer's block. He used to have to take Valium and drink a lot of alcohol just to get through his performances toward the end there. And he was just really abusing himself. At the end, he ended up moving back in with his sister, and until finally he took his life. But as a public speaker, he was direct, straightforward. He talked about his views, his political views, which I really respect. Like a lot of music during that time, I appreciate that kind of thing. Like I said, emotions that he used, humor, wit, and the distinctive power of his voice. And I really enjoyed the opportunity to learn about Phil Ochs.